The mansion gleamed in the soft glow of countless fairy lights, a monument to wealth and success. Inside, Nicholas Hartman, the renowned CEO of Hartman Industries, moved through the crowd of impeccably dressed guests with a practiced air of authority. His staff buzzed around him, ensuring the annual holiday party unfolded perfectly. It was, after all, one of the most anticipated events of the year, a testament to his status and influence. Nicholas barely noticed the decorations or the murmurs of admiration from his guests. Christmas had long since lost its magic for him. To him, the holiday was nothing more than a public relations opportunity. He offered a polite smile here, a firm handshake there, but his mind was already turning toward the next business deal. Sentimentality had no place in his life. Not anymore. Outside, the winter air bit harshly, and the snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the estate grounds. Beyond the towering gates of the Hartman property, a small figure trudged through the snow, shivering with every step. The boy, no more than 8 years old, was wrapped in a threadbare coat several sizes too big. His boots were mismatched, and his hands were bare, red from the biting cold. Clutched tightly to his chest was a worn stuffed bear, its fur matted and its seams frayed. The boy's name was Sammy, and he was on a mission. He had seen the grand mansion from afar and, despite the imposing gates and the guards stationed outside, he had convinced himself he needed to reach it. Maybe the people inside could help. Maybe they had food. Maybe, just maybe, someone would care. Summoning courage he didn't know he had, Sammy pressed the buzzer on the gate. The intercom crackled to life. "Who's there?" a gruff voice demanded. Sammy's voice was small and shaky. "Please, I'm hungry. I just need a little food." Inside the mansion, the head of security alerted Nicholas to the disturbance. His brow furrowed in irritation as he glanced at the security monitor. The sight of the ragged child at his gate filled him with a mix of discomfort and annoyance. "Deal with it," Nicholas ordered curtly, turning back to his guests. The head of security hesitated. "Sir, he's just a kid. It's Christmas Eve." Nicholas exhaled sharply and followed the man to the monitor. The image of Sammy, clutching the battered bear, flickered on the screen. For a brief moment, something stirred deep within Nicholas, a memory he couldn't quite place. But he shook it off. "Escort him away," Nicholas said firmly. "This isn't the place for charity." The security team approached the gate, their heavy boots crunching through the snow. Sammy didn't resist as they gently but firmly turned him away. He clutched his bear tighter, tears stinging his eyes as he stumbled back into the cold night. "Wait," one of the guards called, noticing something fall from Sammy's grasp. But the boy didn't hear him and disappeared into the darkness. The object was small, almost inconspicuous, but when the guard picked it up, he hesitated before pocketing it. It was a stuffed bear's arm, torn from the toy in Sammy's rush to leave. The night wore on, and the party continued without interruption. Nicholas mingled, sipped expensive champagne, and feigned cheerfulness for the sake of appearances. But as the hours dragged by, he found himself oddly unsettled. He couldn't shake the image of the boy standing in the snow, clutching that bear with such desperation. It gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, refusing to be ignored. The guests finally departed, their laughter and well-wishes fading into the frosty air. Nicholas retired to his study, eager to drown out the nagging feeling with a glass of scotch. But when he glanced out the window, he caught a glimpse of the gate and the snowy path beyond it. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt compelled to investigate. He donned his coat and ventured outside, his polished shoes crunching in the snow. The bitter cold stung his face as he reached the gate. His eyes scanned the ground, searching for any trace of the boy. Then, near the edge of the property, something caught his eye, a small stuffed bear, missing an arm. Nicholas bent down and picked it up, brushing off the snow. The bear was old, its fur faded and patched in places. It was a simple toy, but there was something achingly familiar about it. A wave of unease swept over him as he turned it in his hands. Inside, the head of security appeared at the door, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Sir, that's the boy's. He dropped it when we turned him away." Nicholas stared at the bear, his heart pounding for reasons he didn't understand. Memories he had buried deep began to surface. The sound of laughter, the sight of a small boy running through a garden with a bear much like this one tucked under his arm. "Do you know where he went?" Nicholas asked, his voice low. The guard shook his head. "We tried to call him back, but he was gone before we could stop him." Nicholas tightened his grip on the bear. For the first time in years, something other than profit or reputation occupied his mind. Without fully understanding why, he felt an urgent need to find the boy. And deep down, a whisper of a memory told him that this wasn't just about charity. The night was restless for Nicholas. The worn stuffed bear sat on his desk, a stark contrast to the sleek, polished surfaces of his office. It seemed out of place, but no more so than the storm of emotions that churned within him. Memories he had long buried began to creep into his consciousness. Memories of his son, Alex, who had been the light of his life before vanishing without a trace nearly 10 years ago. Nicholas had spent years searching, hiring private investigators and spending fortunes, only to be left with silence and pain. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. It was ridiculous to think that a random boy and his toy could stir up such feelings. Yet, the unease gnawed at him, a persistent reminder that something about the encounter wasn't ordinary. By morning, Nicholas had made up his mind. He couldn't let it go. He summoned his head of security, a middle-aged man named Carter who had been with him for over a decade. Carter entered the study, his expression professional but curious. "I need you to find that boy," Nicholas said, his voice curt but resolute. "The one from last night." Carter raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. "Do you have any specific instructions? A time frame?" "Now," Nicholas replied. "I don't care what it takes or how much it costs. Find him." Carter nodded and left without another word. Nicholas stared at the bear again, running his fingers over the frayed stitching. What was it about this toy that tugged at him so deeply? He didn't have an answer, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. By afternoon, Carter returned with an update. He had tracked down the boy's movements to a nearby shelter where several children were known to stay. Nicholas wasted no time. He canceled his meetings and ordered the car brought around. The thought of stepping into a world so far removed from his own made him uncomfortable, but the pull to see the boy again overrode his hesitation. The shelter was a stark contrast to the opulence of his life. The walls were dingy, the air smelled faintly of mildew, and the chatter of children echoed through the narrow hallways. Nicholas stood out like a sore thumb in his tailored suit, but he ignored the curious glances of the staff and made his way to the office of the shelter's director. The woman who greeted him was kind but cautious. Her name was Margaret, and she had been running the shelter for nearly 20 years. When Nicholas explained his reason for coming, she leaned back in her chair and studied him with a critical eye. "You're looking for a boy named Sammy," she said after a moment. "He comes and goes. Sweet kid, but he doesn't trust easily. Do you know where he is now?" Nicholas asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Margaret frowned. "He hasn't been back since yesterday. Sometimes he sleeps here. Other times, he's out on the streets. He's resourceful for his age, but it's no life for a child." Nicholas's jaw tightened. "Do you know anything about his family?" Margaret hesitated, then sighed. "He has a mother, Grace. She's been through more than you could imagine. They came here about a year ago. She's protective almost to a fault, but I think it's because she's scared. She doesn't talk much about her past." The name hit Nicholas like a punch to the gut. Grace, his daughter's name. It couldn't be a coincidence, could it? He gripped the edge of the desk, his mind racing. "Do you know where I can find her?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Margaret shook her head. "She moves around a lot. She's been hurt before. She doesn't like to stay in one place for too long. But Sammy might know." Nicholas nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "If he comes back, will you let me know? I need to talk to him." Margaret agreed, and Nicholas left the shelter with a strange mix of hope and apprehension. The idea that Grace might still be alive was almost too much to process. He had spent years mourning her, believing she had died in an accident after their relationship had soured. If she was alive, and if this boy was connected to her, it would change everything. The next 2 days were a blur of activity. Nicholas used every resource at his disposal to search for Sammy, but the boy seemed to have vanished. The city was vast, and its streets were an unforgiving maze. Carter and his team combed through shelters, soup kitchens, and parks, but their efforts yielded nothing. On the third evening, just as Nicholas was beginning to despair, his phone buzzed with a call from Margaret. Sammy had returned to the shelter. Nicholas was out the door in minutes, his heart pounding as his car sped through the city streets. When he arrived at the shelter, Margaret was waiting for him at the entrance. "He's in the playroom," she said quietly. "Go easy on him. He's been through a lot." Nicholas nodded and entered the room. Sammy was sitting cross-legged on the floor, engrossed in a puzzle. The sight of the boy sent a surge of emotion through Nicholas. He approached slowly, careful not to startle him. "Sammy," he said gently. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. He recognized Nicholas immediately and shrank back slightly, clutching the edge of the puzzle. "I'm not here to hurt you," Nicholas said quickly. "I just want to talk." Sammy hesitated, then nodded, though his posture remained tense. Nicholas crouched down to his level and held out the stuffed bear. "You left this," he said. "I thought you might want it back." Sammy's eyes softened as he reached for the bear. He held it close, his small fingers brushing over the missing arm. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Sammy," Nicholas began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Do you know a woman named Grace?" Sammy's grip on the bear tightened, and he nodded slowly. "She's my mom." Nicholas's breath caught. The confirmation was both exhilarating and terrifying. He leaned forward, his gaze intense but kind. "Where is she?" he asked. "Can you take me to her?" Sammy hesitated, uncertainty flickering across his face. Finally, he whispered, "She doesn't like strangers." "I'm not a stranger," Nicholas said, his voice thick with emotion. I think I'm her father." Sammy stared at Nicholas, his small face a mixture of surprise and skepticism. The boy hugged the bear tighter, as though it were a shield against the sudden wave of questions. His young mind seemed to be turning over Nicholas's words, trying to make sense of them. "You're my grandpa?" Sammy asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Nicholas felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He wanted to reach out, to comfort the boy, but he held back, aware of how fragile this interaction was. "I think so," he said carefully. "If your mother's name is Grace, then yes, I'm her father." Sammy's brow furrowed, and he glanced down at the bear in his lap. "She doesn't talk about you. She says it's just us now." A pang of guilt shot through Nicholas. He had always told himself that his strained relationship with Grace had been her choice, but now he wondered if he'd failed her in ways he couldn't yet understand. He wanted to explain, to tell Sammy everything, but he knew it would be too much for a child to process. "Sammy," Nicholas said gently, "I don't know what happened between your mom and me, but I want to make things right. I want to see her, to talk to her. Can you help me find her?" Sammy's eyes searched Nicholas's face, as if trying to decide whether he could be trusted. Finally, the boy nodded, though his expression remained cautious. "Okay, but if she gets mad, it's not my fault." Nicholas allowed himself a small smile. "That's fair." It didn't take long for them to leave the shelter. Nicholas thanked Margaret profusely and promised to support the shelter financially in the future, a gesture that surprised her but was accepted gratefully. Sammy climbed into the back seat of Nicholas's car, clutching the bear like a lifeline as the city blurred past the windows. The boy directed them to a rundown apartment building on the edge of the city. The building was old, with peeling paint and a creaky exterior staircase. Nicholas's heart clenched at the thought of his daughter and grandson living in such conditions. He reminded himself that the important thing was finding her, reconnecting, and beginning to repair the years that had been lost. Sammy led the way up the stairs, his small boots echoing on the metal steps. When they reached a door marked with a crooked number 7, he stopped and looked back at Nicholas. "She might yell," Sammy warned, his voice serious. Nicholas nodded, bracing himself. "I'm ready." Sammy knocked on the door, a quick, familiar pattern. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a woman who looked both startled and exhausted. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her clothes were simple and slightly worn. Her eyes, so much like Nicholas's own, widened when they landed on him. "Grace," Nicholas said softly, his voice catching. Her expression hardened almost instantly. She pushed the door open wider and stepped protectively in front of Sammy. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her tone sharp with anger and fear. Nicholas held up his hands, a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I didn't know you were alive. I thought you died." Grace finished bitterly. "I know. That's what you were told, wasn't it? Easier to think I was gone than to face the truth." Her words hit Nicholas like a blow. He took a step closer, but Grace's glare stopped him in his tracks. "I didn't know," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I thought I lost you, Grace. Please, just let me explain." Grace hesitated, her body tense, as though she were deciding whether to slam the door or let him speak. Sammy looked up at her, his small voice breaking the silence. "Mom, he's nice. He brought my bear back." The sight of her son holding the familiar toy seemed to soften Grace's stance. She let out a heavy sigh and stepped aside, motioning for Nicholas to come in. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, but it was clean and tidy. Nicholas could see signs of a loving home. Sammy's drawings taped to the walls, a well-worn couch with a colorful blanket draped over it, and a small Christmas tree decorated with handmade ornaments. It was a stark contrast to the cold luxury of his own home. Grace crossed her arms and leaned against the wall, her expression guarded. "You have 5 minutes," she said. Nicholas nodded, grateful for even that much. He sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. "I didn't know you were still alive," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I thought I lost you in that car accident. When they told me, I didn't question it. I should have." Grace's eyes narrowed. "You didn't question it because you didn't care. You pushed me away long before that, Dad. You made it clear I wasn't good enough for your perfect life." "That's not true," Nicholas said quickly. "I was angry, yes, but I never stopped loving you. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I never wanted to lose you." Grace's gaze faltered for a moment, and Nicholas saw a flicker of pain beneath her anger. "I didn't leave because I wanted to," she said quietly. "I left because I had no choice. You didn't want me. You didn't want my life. And when I tried to reach out, I was shut out." Nicholas's chest tightened. "Grace, I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know. If I had, I would have done everything to bring you back." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the heater. Sammy climbed onto the couch and sat beside his mother, looking back and forth between her and Nicholas. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can believe you," she said. "Not yet." Nicholas nodded, his throat tight. "I'll prove it to you. Whatever it takes, I'll prove it." Grace studied him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. Slowly, she nodded. "We'll see," she said, her tone cautious but not entirely closed off. It wasn't the reunion Nicholas had imagined, but it was a start. As he left the apartment that night, he knew he had been given a second chance, however fragile it might be, and he was determined not to waste it. The next few days were a delicate dance of cautious interactions and quiet observations. Nicholas made it clear he wasn't going anywhere, but he respected Grace's boundaries, waiting for her to set the pace. He visited the apartment daily, bringing groceries, repairing small things that needed fixing, and spending time with Sammy. Each visit felt like a step forward, though small, in rebuilding the bridge he had thought was forever burned. Sammy, for his part, seemed to warm to Nicholas more quickly than Grace. The boy was curious, always asking questions about Nicholas's life, his work, and even his favorite Christmas memories. Nicholas found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years, sharing stories about Grace's childhood and the holidays they had spent together before everything went wrong. The light in Sammy's eyes as he listened was both heartwarming and heartbreaking, a reminder of the time that had been stolen from them. One afternoon, as Nicholas helped Sammy build a snowman in the small courtyard of the apartment complex, Grace watched from the window. She had her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. It wasn't the first time she had observed them, but this time something about the scene made her linger. Nicholas, laughing and patting snow into place, looked so different from the man she remembered. Cold, distant, and driven only by ambition. She wanted to believe he had changed, but part of her couldn't let go of the pain he had caused. Later that evening, as Sammy slept, Grace and Nicholas sat at the small kitchen table. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Grace sipped her tea, her eyes fixed on the mug as she spoke. "Why now?" she asked, her voice even but laced with skepticism. "Why are you doing all this? You could have just walked away again." Nicholas met her gaze, his expression earnest. "I thought you were gone, Grace. I thought I had lost you forever. When I saw Sammy, when I saw that bear, it brought back everything. I can't explain it, but something told me I had to find you." Grace frowned, her grip tightening on the mug. "You didn't even try to find out the truth before. You just accepted what they told you." "I know," Nicholas admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I was blind. I let my anger and pride get in the way, and I've regretted it every day since." Grace looked away, her jaw tightening. "You don't know what it was like for me. I was alone, scared, and pregnant. I needed you, but you weren't there." Nicholas reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. "I'm here now," he said softly. "I know it's not enough to make up for the past, but I want to be here for you and Sammy. I want to make things right." For a long moment, Grace didn't respond. When she finally looked at him, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, "but I want to try. For Sammy." It wasn't an easy thing for her to say, and Nicholas could see the effort it took. He nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "That's all I can ask." In the days that followed, the tentative truce between Grace and Nicholas began to solidify. They spent more time together as a family, though Grace remained guarded. She allowed Nicholas to accompany her and Sammy to the park, to help decorate the small Christmas tree, and even to share stories from her years away. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Nicholas learned that Grace had been manipulated by someone close to him, a trusted advisor who had intercepted her letters and fabricated the story of her death. The revelation filled him with a rage he hadn't felt in years, but he forced himself to focus on the present. Righting the wrongs of the past would come later. For now, his priority was Grace and Sammy. On Christmas Eve, Nicholas invited Grace and Sammy to his mansion. It was a bold move, one he knew could backfire, but he wanted them to see a different side of him. Grace hesitated at first, wary of stepping back into the world she had left behind, but Sammy's excitement ultimately swayed her. The mansion was transformed into a winter wonderland, with twinkling lights, garlands, and a towering Christmas tree decorated in shimmering gold and silver. Sammy's eyes widened as they stepped inside, taking in the grandeur. Nicholas had arranged for a special dinner and even hired carolers to sing Sammy's favorite holiday songs. As the evening progressed, Nicholas watched Grace relax, a small smile tugging at her lips as she listened to Sammy chatter excitedly about the decorations. It was the first time in years he had seen her look genuinely at ease, and it filled him with a warmth he couldn't describe. After dinner, they gathered around the fireplace. Sammy, his bear tucked under one arm, climbed onto Nicholas's lap and leaned against him. Nicholas wrapped an arm around the boy, his heart swelling with a love he hadn't felt since Alex had been a child. Grace watched them, her eyes softening as she saw the way Nicholas interacted with Sammy. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had truly changed. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the arrival of Christmas, Nicholas handed Sammy a small, carefully wrapped package. Sammy tore it open eagerly, revealing a new stuffed bear with a tag that read, "Forever Family." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she realized the significance of the gift. Sammy hugged the bear tightly, then looked up at Nicholas. "Thank you, Grandpa," he said, his voice filled with pure joy. Nicholas's throat tightened. He looked at Grace, his gaze full of gratitude and hope. She gave him a small nod, her eyes shining with emotion. It wasn't a perfect ending, not yet, but it was a beginning, and for Nicholas, that was more than enough. The days after Christmas brought a sense of quiet transformation to the lives of Nicholas, Grace, and Sammy. The initial awkwardness between Nicholas and Grace began to ease, replaced by cautious understanding. Nicholas found himself spending more and more time at the apartment, learning about their routines and offering help where he could. For Grace, it was strange but not unwelcome to see her father so involved in their lives after so many years of absence. Sammy, ever the optimist, seemed to embrace the changes wholeheartedly. His relationship with Nicholas grew stronger with each passing day. They played board games, read bedtime stories, and even worked together on a school project about family traditions. For Sammy, having a grandfather was a novelty he treasured, and for Nicholas, it was a second chance to be the kind of family figure he had failed to be for Grace. But the past wasn't so easily forgotten. One evening, as Sammy slept and the apartment was quiet, Grace and Nicholas sat together on the worn couch. Nicholas had brought over old photo albums from his mansion, hoping to share them with Grace. They flipped through the pages together, the images stirring bittersweet memories of happier times. "Do you remember this?" Nicholas asked, pointing to a picture of Grace as a young girl, her hair in pigtails and her smile wide as she held up a trophy from a school spelling bee. Grace nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "I do. You were so proud that day. I remember you telling everyone at work about it." Nicholas chuckled softly. "You were brilliant. You still are." The moment of shared warmth faded as Grace turned the page and came to a photo of her mother. Her expression hardened, and she closed the album abruptly. "I can't pretend it was all good, Dad," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "There were so many times when I felt like I wasn't enough for you. Like I was just another part of your perfect image." Nicholas's chest tightened. He had been bracing himself for this conversation, knowing it was inevitable. "I know I made mistakes, Grace," he said. "I was so focused on building a life for us that I lost sight of what really mattered. I didn't see how much I was hurting you until it was too late." Grace stared at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. "Do you really mean that? Or are you just saying it because you want to make things better now?" Nicholas leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I mean it. Every word. I can't change the past, Grace, but I can try to make amends. I want to be here for you and Sammy, for as long as you'll let me." Grace looked away, her jaw tightening. "It's not that easy. There's so much history, so much hurt. I don't know if I can just let it all go." "You don't have to," Nicholas said gently. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight. All I ask is that you give me a chance to prove I've changed." Grace sighed, the weight of years of pain and anger pressing heavily on her shoulders. "I'll try," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "For Sammy's sake, I'll try." Nicholas nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. It was a small step, but it was more than he could have hoped for. In the weeks that followed, Nicholas began making tangible changes to show Grace he was serious about his commitment to their family. He set up a trust fund for Sammy's education, ensuring that the boy would never have to struggle the way Grace had. He also made arrangements to renovate the apartment building, improving the living conditions not just for Grace and Sammy, but for all the tenants. Grace watched these efforts with a mixture of skepticism and admiration. While she appreciated the gestures, she still struggled to reconcile this version of her father with the man she had known growing up. But Sammy's happiness was undeniable, and that gave her hope. One afternoon, as Grace returned from running errands, she found Nicholas and Sammy sitting on the floor of the apartment, surrounded by scraps of fabric and craft supplies. They were making a new outfit for Sammy's beloved bear, stitching tiny buttons onto a makeshift vest. "What's all this?" Grace asked, setting down her bags and raising an eyebrow. "Grandpa said Mr. Bear needed a wardrobe upgrade," Sammy explained, holding up the bear proudly. "Do you like it?" Grace couldn't help but smile. "It's very stylish," she said, ruffling Sammy's hair. Nicholas looked up, his expression hopeful. "We thought it might be fun to do something together. Maybe you'd like to join us?" Grace hesitated, the offer catching her off guard. For so long, she had been the one holding everything together, carrying the weight of their little family on her shoulders. The idea of letting Nicholas share that burden, even in something as simple as a craft project, felt both foreign and strangely comforting. "Sure," she said, sitting down beside them. "But don't expect me to be any good at sewing." The three of them spent the afternoon laughing and working together, the tension between Grace and Nicholas easing as they shared stories and jokes. For the first time in years, Grace felt a glimmer of what she had thought was lost, a sense of family, of belonging. As the sun set and the apartment filled with the warm glow of the golden hour, Grace looked at Nicholas and saw not the distant, demanding father she had grown up with, but a man who was trying, in every way he knew how, to make amends. It wasn't a perfect picture, but it was real. And for Grace, that was a start. Winter began to loosen its grip, the snow outside melting into slushy puddles that reflected the weak sunlight. Life settled into a new rhythm for Nicholas, Grace, and Sammy. What had started as tentative and fragile began to feel more like a family. Grace, while still guarded, found herself softening, allowing Nicholas into parts of her life she had once walled off completely. Sammy, as always, was the glue, his cheerful energy brightening even the most difficult days. One evening, as Nicholas walked Sammy home from school, the boy skipped along the sidewalk, his stuffed bear bouncing in one hand. Nicholas marveled at the ease with which Sammy accepted him. It was as though the boy had always known this was how things should be. "Grandpa," Sammy said suddenly, his tone serious, "do you think people can really change?" The question caught Nicholas off guard. He slowed his steps, glancing down at Sammy. "I do," he said after a moment, "but it's not always easy. It takes time, effort, and a lot of mistakes along the way." Sammy nodded thoughtfully, his small face scrunched in concentration. "Mom says people don't change, but I think maybe you did." Nicholas stopped walking and knelt down to Sammy's level, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your mom's been through a lot," he said gently. "Sometimes it's hard to believe in change when you've been hurt. But I'm trying, Sammy. Every day, I'm trying to be better. For you and your mom." Sammy smiled, his youthful optimism shining through. "I think you're doing a good job." Nicholas felt his throat tighten with emotion. He ruffled Sammy's hair affectionately. "Thank you, kiddo. That means a lot." When they reached the apartment, Grace was waiting by the window, as she often did. She greeted them with a small smile, her arms crossed as she leaned against the kitchen counter. "How was school?" she asked Sammy, pulling him into a quick hug. "It was good. Grandpa and I talked about stuff," Sammy replied, darting off to his room to put away his backpack. Grace raised an eyebrow at Nicholas. "What kind of stuff?" "Deep questions about life and change," Nicholas said with a faint smile. "Your son's a philosopher." Grace shook her head, amused despite herself. "He gets that from his grandpa, I guess." "You always did like to overthink everything." Nicholas chuckled. "Guilty as charged." The warmth of the moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Grace frowned, glancing at Nicholas before walking over to answer it. When she opened the door, her expression immediately darkened. Standing there was a man Nicholas recognized all too well, Arthur Wallace, his former business advisor. The man had aged since Nicholas had last seen him, his hair grayer and his face more lined. But his presence was just as unwelcome. "What are you doing here?" Grace demanded, her tone cold. Arthur offered a thin smile. "I came to see how you're doing, Grace. It's been a long time." Nicholas stepped forward, his posture tense. "She doesn't need you checking in on her, Arthur." Arthur's smile didn't waver, but there was a glint in his eyes that made Nicholas's blood boil. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said smoothly. "I simply thought it was time to set the record straight." Grace crossed her arms, her expression a mix of anger and confusion. "Set the record straight about what?" Arthur looked past her, his gaze landing on Nicholas. "About why your father never came for you." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Grace's eyes darted to Nicholas, then back to Arthur. "What are you talking about?" she asked. Arthur sighed, feigning regret. "It's true that I intercepted your letters, Grace, but I wasn't acting alone. Your father knew. He agreed it was for the best." Nicholas felt the floor tilt beneath him. "That's a lie," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "I had no idea." Arthur shrugged, his expression infuriatingly calm. "Believe what you want. I was just following orders." Grace's face went pale, her eyes filling with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. "Is that true?" she asked Nicholas, her voice trembling. "Did you know about the letters?" Nicholas shook his head vehemently. No, Grace, I swear to you, I didn't know. I would never have agreed to that. But doubt flickered in Grace's eyes, the old wounds reopening. How can I believe you? After everything, Arthur's smirk deepened. It's hard to know who to trust, isn't it? Nicholas clenched his fists, his anger barely contained. You've done enough damage, Arthur. Leave. Arthur raised his hands in mock surrender. As you wish. But the truth has a way of coming out. He turned and walked away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Grace stood frozen, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Nicholas reached out to her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. I can't do this right now, she said, her voice barely audible. I need time. Nicholas nodded, though his heart ached. Take all the time you need, he said softly. I'll be here. Grace retreated to her room, closing the door behind her. Nicholas stood alone in the small living room, the weight of Arthur's words pressing down on him. He knew the damage had been done, and he could only hope that Grace would find it in her heart to trust him again. As the night wore on, Nicholas sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. Sammy eventually came out of his room and climbed onto his lap, his small arms wrapping around Nicholas's neck. Mom will be okay, Sammy said, his voice full of quiet confidence. She just needs time. Nicholas held Sammy close, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. I hope you're right, Sammy, he whispered. I really hope you're right. The days following Arthur's visit were heavy with tension. Grace withdrew, her guarded nature returning in full force. Nicholas tried to give her the space she needed, but the distance between them was palpable. Sammy noticed the change too, though he didn't say much. He clung a little closer to Nicholas, sensing that something important was hanging in the balance. Nicholas spent his time strategizing. He had always been a man of action, someone who believed in solving problems through persistence and determination. But this was different. He couldn't force Grace to believe him, and he couldn't undo the damage that Arthur's lies had sown. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. One afternoon, while Grace was out, Nicholas sat in the small living room, flipping through the same photo album they had looked at together weeks ago. Sammy was beside him, his stuffed bear perched on his lap. Grandpa, Sammy said, breaking the silence, why does Mom get so sad when she talks about the past? Nicholas closed the album carefully, placing it on the coffee table. He looked at Sammy, searching for the right words. Your mom went through a lot of hard things, he said, and some of those things happened because of me. Sammy frowned. Did you hurt her? Nicholas's throat tightened. Not on purpose, he said quietly, but I wasn't there for her when she needed me. And that hurt her more than I realized. Sammy was silent for a moment, his small hands gripping the bear. Do you think she'll forgive you? I hope so, Nicholas said, his voice steady. But forgiveness takes time. And even if she doesn't, I'll still do everything I can to be here for her. And for you? Sammy seemed to mull this over, his young mind working through the complexity of the situation. Finally, he gave a small nod, as if accepting Nicholas's answer. I think she will, he said confidently. She loves you. She just forgot for a little while. Nicholas's chest ached at the boy's simple but profound words. He reached over and ruffled Sammy's hair. You're a pretty smart kid. You know that? Sammy grinned. I know. Later that evening, Grace returned home, her expression tired but resolute. She set her bag down and hesitated in the doorway, as though summoning the courage to speak. Dad, she said finally, her voice softer than he had heard in days. Nicholas looked up from the book he had been pretending to read. Yes? Can we talk? He nodded, setting the book aside and standing. Of course. Let's go into the kitchen. They sat across from each other at the small table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Grace fidgeted with her hands, her eyes fixed on the worn tabletop. I've been thinking about what Arthur said, she began. And I don't know what to believe. Part of me wants to trust you, but another part keeps reminding me of all the times you weren't there. Nicholas leaned forward, his gaze steady. Grace, I can't undo the mistakes I made. I can't go back and be the father you needed back then. But I promise you, I had no idea what Arthur was doing. If I had, I would have stopped him. I would have fought for you. Grace looked up, her eyes filled with uncertainty. How can I know you're telling the truth? Nicholas hesitated. He had no concrete proof, no way to erase the seeds of doubt Arthur had planted. But he had something stronger, his commitment to rebuilding their relationship. You can't know, he admitted. Not for sure. All I can do is show you, every day, that I'm here now. That I'm not going anywhere. Grace studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. I want to believe you, she said finally. But it's going to take time. Nicholas nodded, relief washing over him. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. The next morning, Nicholas decided to confront the man who had caused so much pain. He tracked down Arthur's address and arrived at the modest office where the disgraced advisor now worked. When Nicholas entered, Arthur looked up from his desk, a smug smile spreading across his face. Ah, Nicholas, Arthur said smoothly. What brings you here? Come to thank me for exposing the truth? Nicholas's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. You've done enough damage, Arthur. It's time you stopped meddling in my family's life. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his smile unshaken. I only told Grace what she deserved to know. If that complicates things for you, well, that's not my problem. Nicholas stepped closer, his voice low and firm. You and I both know the truth. You manipulated Grace to protect your own interests, not mine. And now you're trying to tear us apart for no other reason than spite. Arthur's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. Believe what you want, Nicholas. But Grace is a smart woman. She'll figure out who you really are. Nicholas stared at him, his resolve unshaken. She already knows who I am, and she knows who you are too. Stay away from her, Arthur. This is the last warning you'll get. Without waiting for a response, Nicholas turned and walked out of the office, his steps confident and purposeful. He couldn't undo the damage Arthur had caused, but he could protect his family moving forward. When Nicholas returned to the apartment, Grace was waiting for him, a hint of worry in her expression. Where were you? She asked. I had to take care of something, he said simply. It's done now. Grace didn't press further, but the look in her eyes told him she appreciated his effort. It wasn't an outright declaration of forgiveness, but it was a step forward. And for Nicholas, that was enough. As the evening settled in, the three of them gathered in the living room. Sammy curled up beside Grace, his bear tucked under his arm, while Nicholas read aloud from a storybook. The warmth of their little family filled the room, a fragile but growing bond that promised better days ahead. Winter gave way to the soft bloom of early spring, and with it came subtle changes in the rhythms of their lives. Grace began to let Nicholas take on a more active role, not just with Sammy, but in helping to support her, too. At first, she resisted his offers to assist with the things that had always been her responsibility. She'd spent years learning to rely only on herself, and old habits were hard to break. But over time, as Nicholas proved his reliability, Grace started to loosen her grip on the control she clung to so fiercely. Sammy, ever the peacemaker, seemed to delight in the newfound harmony in their little family. He would often orchestrate simple activities, card games, movie nights, or visits to the park where he'd insist on showing off his latest skills on the playground. Nicholas never missed a chance to participate, and Grace found herself smiling more often than she had in years. One Saturday, Sammy decided they needed a family picnic. Nicholas arrived early that morning with a basket packed full of food from a local bakery, along with a kite he had bought on a whim. The idea of flying a kite seemed to excite Sammy more than the picnic itself, and he wasted no time dragging Nicholas and Grace to the nearby park. The day was sunny but brisk, the kind of weather that made your cheeks rosy and the air smell crisp. Sammy took off across the grass, laughing as Nicholas helped him hold the kite string steady against the wind. Grace watched them from her spot on the blanket, her heart swelling at the sight. She could hear their laughter echo across the park, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe that this fragile peace might last. When Nicholas returned to the blanket, his face was flushed, and his hair was slightly disheveled from chasing after the kite. He sat down beside Grace, catching his breath. Sammy was still running, the kite soaring high above him like a splash of color against the blue sky. "You're good with him," Grace said softly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Nicholas glanced at her, his expression warm. "He makes it easy," he replied. "He's a great kid." Grace nodded, her gaze lingering on her son. "He's everything to me. I've tried so hard to give him a good life. But it's been hard." Nicholas's brow furrowed. "You've done an amazing job, Grace. I can see how much he loves and respects you. You're an incredible mother." Grace looked down, her fingers toying with the corner of the blanket. "It wasn't always enough. There were times when I felt like I was failing him. Times when I thought I couldn't do it on my own." "You shouldn't have had to," Nicholas said quietly. "If I'd known you were out there, if I'd known about Sammy, things would have been different." Grace looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "I want to believe that," she admitted. "And I'm trying. It's just, there's so much history between us." Nicholas nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know. And I don't expect you to forget the past, Grace. But I hope we can move forward. I hope I can earn your trust." Grace held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "You're getting there," she said with a small smile. "Slowly, but you're getting there." It was a tentative step, but for Nicholas, it felt monumental. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and sunshine, and by the time they returned home, Sammy was asleep in the back seat, his head resting against the car window. Nicholas carried him upstairs, tucking him into bed with the same care he had once given his own son so many years ago. That night, after Sammy was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Grace and Nicholas sat together on the couch. The television was on, but neither of them was paying much attention. The earlier conversation lingered in the air between them, unspoken but present. "Dad," Grace said suddenly, breaking the silence, "there's something I need to know." Nicholas turned to her, his expression open and curious. "What is it?" Grace hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "Do you ever think about Alex?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hit Nicholas like a wave, the name bringing with it a flood of memories both beautiful and painful. He took a deep breath, his eyes clouding with emotion. "Every day," he admitted. "There's not a moment that goes by when I don't think about him." Grace nodded, her own eyes glistening. "Me too. I still remember the way he used to chase me around the garden with that ridiculous water gun, and the way he could make you laugh, even when you were trying to be serious." Nicholas smiled, the memory bittersweet. "He had a way of doing that," he said. "He was such a light in our lives." Grace wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling. Do you think he'd be proud of us? Of where we are now?" Nicholas reached over and took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. "I think he'd be happy to see us together again," he said. "And I think he'd be proud of you, Grace. You've been through so much, and you've come out stronger than ever." Grace's grip on his hand tightened, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to lean on him, to let him share the weight of her grief. They sat in silence, their hands intertwined, as the television played softly in the background. It wasn't a perfect resolution. The wounds of the past were still there, but they were healing. And for the first time in years, Nicholas felt a glimmer of hope that his family might truly find a way to move forward. As the night deepened, Grace eventually fell asleep, her head resting on Nicholas's shoulder. He stayed awake, watching her with a mix of love and guilt, silently vowing to never let her down again. Sammy stirred in his room, murmuring softly in his sleep, and Nicholas felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the second chance he had been given. For years, he had lived in the shadow of loss, believing that his chance at happiness had been stolen from him. But now, with Grace and Sammy by his side, he realized that happiness wasn't something he had lost. It was something he could rebuild, one small step at a time. The weeks rolled by with the steady promise of spring. The chill of winter faded, replaced by the warm whispers of sunlight and the scent of blooming flowers. Grace seemed lighter in those days, her guarded nature slowly giving way to moments of unfiltered joy. She laughed more, her smiles more frequent, and Sammy soaked it all in, delighted by the change in their family dynamic. Nicholas, too, felt the transformation, though he carried it quietly, knowing how delicate this newfound peace was. One afternoon, while Sammy was at school, Nicholas arrived at the apartment with an envelope in hand. Grace opened the door, her hair tied back in a loose bun and her expression curious as she noticed the serious look on his face. "What's that?" she asked, nodding toward the envelope. Nicholas stepped inside, holding it out to her. "Something I thought you should see." Grace hesitated before taking it. She opened the flap and pulled out a stack of documents, her brow furrowing as she scanned the pages. They were legal records, meticulously detailed, outlining the actions Arthur had taken to manipulate her disappearance all those years ago. Letters that had been intercepted, false reports filed, and even a financial trail that proved he had benefited from her absence. "I had my lawyers dig into everything," Nicholas explained, his voice steady but firm. "Arthur orchestrated it all. He used my grief and anger to keep me from questioning anything, and he profited from it. I wanted you to know the truth." Grace's hands trembled as she set the documents down on the kitchen table. Her eyes were glassy, a storm of emotions swirling just beneath the surface. "So he did all of this to keep us apart?" Nicholas nodded. "Yes, and I let him, Grace. I was too blinded by my own pain to see what was happening. I failed you." Grace exhaled sharply, sinking into a chair. She stared at the papers for a long moment before speaking. "I always thought you didn't care, that you just moved on without me. But this—" Nicholas sat across from her, his expression soft but resolute. "I cared, Grace. I've always cared. I just didn't know how to show it in the right way. And I can't tell you how sorry I am for everything you went through because of my failure." Grace wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say. It's like everything I believed about the past is being rewritten." Nicholas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I don't expect this to fix everything, but I thought you deserved to know. And I want you to know that Arthur won't hurt us again. I've made sure of that." Grace looked up at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "Thank you for this," she said softly, "for fighting for the truth." Nicholas reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I'll keep fighting, Grace. For you and for Sammy. For our family." The words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. Grace didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she gave it a small squeeze, a silent acknowledgement of the effort Nicholas was making to rebuild what had been broken. Later that evening, as they sat together watching Sammy finish his homework, Grace seemed quieter than usual. Nicholas noticed but didn't push her, giving her the space she needed to process everything. Sammy, oblivious to the weight of their earlier conversation, chatted animatedly about his day at school and the art project he had worked on. When bedtime rolled around, Grace tucked Sammy in while Nicholas lingered in the living room. He could hear their voices from the bedroom, soft and comforting. As Grace read a story Sammy had picked out, the sound filled him with a sense of peace, a reminder of how far they had come. Grace emerged from the bedroom a while later, her face thoughtful. She joined Nicholas on the couch, sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "He's so happy," she said quietly. "Happier than I've ever seen him." Nicholas smiled, his gaze distant. "He's an incredible kid. He deserves all the happiness in the world." Grace turned to him, her expression earnest. "You've done a lot for us, Dad. More than I ever thought you would. I'm starting to see the man you always wanted to be. The man I needed when I was younger." Nicholas met her gaze, his chest tightening with emotion. "I'm just trying to make up for lost time. I know I can't change the past, but I'm here now. And I'll be here as long as you'll have me." Grace reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "I believe you," she said softly, "and I want to keep moving forward. Together." Nicholas's heart swelled at her words. It wasn't a grand declaration of forgiveness, but it was enough. It was hope. The next morning, they made plans to visit the mansion, a place Grace hadn't been in years. Sammy was excited at the prospect, already chattering about the big garden and the possibility of flying his kite there. Grace was more reserved, but there was a spark of curiosity in her eyes, a desire to reconnect with a part of her life she had left behind. As they walked up the driveway, the towering house loomed before them, its grandeur softened by the warmth Nicholas had worked to restore to it. Grace hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the doorknob, but Nicholas stepped beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. "It's just a house," he said gently. "What matters is what we make of it." Grace nodded and pushed the door open. Inside, the air felt different, less cold, more inviting. The once sterile halls were filled with photos of family, books that Sammy would love, and touches of life that had been missing for years. As they moved through the house, Grace began to relax. She laughed as Sammy ran from room to room, marveling at everything. Nicholas watched them, his heart full. This was what he had dreamed of, a chance to rebuild, to fill the house with love and laughter again. By the time they left, the mansion no longer felt like a relic of the past but a foundation for their future. Grace stood on the steps, looking back at the house with a thoughtful smile. "It feels different now," she said. "It feels like home." Nicholas placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. "That's because it is. It always will be, for all of us." As they walked back to the car, the sun dipped low in the sky, casting everything in a warm golden light. The future wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time in years, it felt bright. They were a family, imperfect and mending, but a family nonetheless. Spring deepened into the gentle warmth of early summer, and life found a rhythm for Nicholas, Grace, and Sammy. What once felt tentative now carried a quiet confidence, the bond between them strengthening day by day. Grace, while still cautious at times, had opened herself to the possibility of forgiveness and healing. Nicholas, in turn, had embraced his role not only as Sammy's grandfather, but as the father Grace had needed for so long. One weekend, they planned a family barbecue at the mansion. It was Sammy's idea, inspired by a story he'd heard at school about big family gatherings with games and food. Nicholas had eagerly agreed, going so far as to hire a chef and decorate the sprawling garden with twinkling lights and colorful banners. When the day arrived, the mansion buzzed with activity. Sammy darted around the yard, showing off his kite and chatting with the small group of friends he'd invited from school. Grace stood by the grill, laughing as she tried to manage the unfamiliar task of flipping burgers, her cheeks flushed with the warmth of the sun and her own laughter. Nicholas stood nearby, watching them with a contented smile. As the afternoon wore on, they sat together under a large oak tree, enjoying the feast and the easy flow of conversation. For the first time in years, there was no tension, no lingering shadows of the past. Just family, gathered together in the sunshine. Later, as the guests began to leave, Sammy tugged on Nicholas's sleeve. "Grandpa, can we play hide and seek?" he asked, his eyes shining with excitement. Nicholas grinned. "Of course, but you'd better be ready. I'm pretty good at hiding." Sammy laughed, already running off to find a spot. Grace joined in, her laughter echoing across the yard as she and Sammy tried to outwit Nicholas. The game stretched on into the evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the lawn. When they finally called a truce, the three of them collapsed onto a blanket spread beneath the stars. Sammy lay between them, his bear tucked under one arm, as he pointed out constellations he'd learned about in school. "That one's the Big Dipper," Sammy said, his voice sleepy but animated. "And that's Orion's belt." Nicholas nodded, following the boy's pointing finger. "You're becoming quite the astronomer." Sammy beamed at the praise, his eyelids drooping as he snuggled closer to Grace. She brushed his hair back from his forehead, her touch gentle. As Sammy drifted off to sleep, Grace turned to Nicholas, her voice soft. "Thank you for today. For all of this. I didn't think I'd ever feel whole again." Nicholas's chest tightened with emotion. "You don't have to thank me, Grace. I should be thanking you for giving me this chance." Grace met his gaze, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I wasn't sure we could ever get here," she admitted. "But you proved me wrong. You've shown me what it means to fight for family." Nicholas reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You and Sammy are my family. There's nothing more important to me." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared journey settling between them like a quiet understanding. The mansion, once a symbol of distance and loss, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where they could create new memories, free from the pain of the past. The following morning, Nicholas woke early. The house was quiet, the soft light of dawn streaming through the windows. He made his way to the kitchen, brewing a pot of coffee and settling at the table with a notebook in hand. Over the past weeks, he had started journaling, a practice suggested by Grace as a way to reflect and process everything they had been through. He flipped to a fresh page and began to write, his pen moving steadily across the paper. He wrote about his love for Sammy, his admiration for Grace's resilience, and his own commitment to being the kind of father and grandfather they deserved. The words came easily, flowing from a place of honesty and hope. As he finished, he heard the soft patter of footsteps behind him. Grace appeared in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep and her expression curious. "What are you working on?" she asked. Nicholas smiled, closing the notebook and setting it aside. "Just some thoughts," he said, "trying to keep my head on straight." Grace poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. "It suits you," she said, her tone light but sincere. "I think you've changed more than even you realize." Nicholas considered her words, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe. Or maybe I just finally figured out what really matters." Grace nodded, her eyes warm. "Either way, I'm glad you're here." The sound of Sammy's laughter broke the quiet as he bounded into the kitchen, his stuffed bear clutched tightly in one hand. "Morning," he exclaimed, his energy boundless despite the early hour. "Morning, kiddo," Nicholas said, ruffling Sammy's hair. "What's on the agenda for today?" Sammy grinned. "Can we go to the park? I want to fly my kite again." Grace chuckled. "You're obsessed with that kite." Nicholas stood, stretching. "The park it is. Let's make a day of it." The three of them spent the day together, their laughter echoing through the park as they flew the kite and played games. It was simple, yet it felt extraordinary, a reminder of how far they had come. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they sat on a bench overlooking the park. Sammy leaned against Nicholas, his bear nestled in his lap, while Grace rested her head on Nicholas's shoulder. In that moment, under the fading light of the day, Nicholas felt a profound sense of peace. He had spent so many years chasing success, trying to fill the void left by loss. But now, with his daughter and grandson by his side, he realized that the greatest success of all was love, the kind that endured, healed, and made them whole again. Family bonds can heal even the deepest wounds. What would you do if given a second chance to reconnect? Share your thoughts below. And don't miss the next heartfelt stories coming up. Subscribe and stay inspired.